I am City Councilor at Large Lydia, Vice Chair of the Committee of the Government Operations Committee. It is Monday, March 28, 2022, and we are here today for a virtual hearing on docket number 0239, an ordinance creating a commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans, referred to the committee on February 2nd, 2022. This docket was sponsored by Councilors Mejia, Fernandez, Anderson, and Worrell. In accordance with Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021, modifying certain requirements of the open meeting law and relieving public bodies of certain requirements, including the requirement that public bodies conduct its meetings in a public space, place that is open and physically accessible to the public. The City Council will be conducting this hearing virtually via Zoom, and it is being recorded. This enables the City Council to carry out its responsibilities while adhering to public health accommodations and ensuring public access to its deliberations through adequate alternative means. The public may watch this hearing via live stream at www.boston.gov/city-council-TV and on Xfinity 8, RCN 82, Verizon 964. It will also be rebroadcasted at a later date. Written comments may be sent to the committee email at ccc.go@boston.gov and will be made part of the record and available to all councilors. Public testimony will be taken at the end of this hearing. And for those that have signed up already, our central staff is currently working to get the links emailed out to everyone. So thank you for your patience, and we're happy that everyone can be here. This morning, I'm joined by my council colleagues for this important discussion. I'm happy that we're having it. The council order of arrival is our council president, Ed Flynn, Councilor at Large Julia Mejia, and lead sponsor for this ordinance, Councilor Lydia Edwards, Councilor Brian Worrell, and Councilor Liz Braden, and Councilor Kenzie Bach. We are also joined by members of the administration, Chief Mariangeli Solis Severa from the Office of Equity and Inclusion, and Lori Nelson, the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Boston. And we're also joined by a great panel of advocates who've been very supportive. First is Dr. Jamadari Kamara, Director of the Center for African, Caribbean, and Community Development, Yvette Modister, Commissioner of the National African American Reparations Commission, and Dr. Raymond Winbush, Director of the Institute for Urban Research at Morgan State University. This ordinance would establish a special commission on the study of reparation proposals. The commission would include 50 members to be appointed by the mayor, 2 of which shall be youth members. Of the 15 members, 5 members would be represented by community organizations, including the Boston branch of the NAACP, the New Democracy Coalition, King Boston, UMass Boston African Studies Department, and Encuentro Diaspora Afro. The remaining 10 members would be chosen by community organizations just listed in consultation with the mayor and city council. As currently written, the ordinance would require that each member be paid $100 per hour, not to exceed $50,000 per year. The commission's duties would include defining reparations, studying disparities and inequalities, documenting personal stories and histories, and creating spaces for information sharing. The commission's findings would be synthesized in a report with specific reparation proposals that address international standards of remedy, how the city will offer a formal apology for its role in the perpetuation of human rights violations and crimes against humanity, and how the city's current laws and policies continue to disproportionately negatively affect African Americans. The commission would also include an executive director appointed by the mayor, who shall have administrative powers to hire an assistant, submit a budget, and assist with procurement and supplies. We will be doing opening remarks and Q&A a little bit different. We'll be doing them together after the administration panel due to a time constraint. Thank you to all my colleagues for being here and for your patience in the switch up. So now I'll have the honor of turning it over to the administration. First up is Lori Nelson, Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Boston. Thank you so much for joining us, Lori, for this important conversation on this ordinance. You now have the floor.
Thank you so much, Councilor, and to the City Council and to the body assembled. Thank you for those who are also here with us relative to those community organizations who have worked hard on this work. Certainly our goal today is to listen and to understand further from each of you how to understand and move forward with the work of reparations. I am here and joined with Chief Mariangeli Solis Severa, who is leading this charge with us relative to equity and inclusion. And our goal, again, is to hear and to listen and to learn and to think of a pathway forward together. So I want to thank you for allowing us this time to be with you and look forward to hearing and learning as we move forward. Thank you so much, Counselor.
Thank you so much. I don't know if Maria Angelis, if you want to go next, or
Lori has to hop off at 10:30 for an ARPA funding conversation. I'm going to stay until the end, so I'll follow your order.
Awesome. And so, by order of arrival of my colleagues, we're going to open up the floor for questions. And so, I'm going to start with the lead sponsor for this ordinance, Councilor Julia Mejia.
Thank you, everyone. And in the interest of keeping Lori here as much as possible, I'm just going to ask two quick questions and then move on to my colleagues. You know, our ordinance stipulates that members of this commission who will be exploring issues such as the historical economic disempowerment of African-American community. We are wondering, you know, in terms of the way we've written it, that they will be paid for their time. Do you have any insight from the administration about how they're landing on this idea? And then also, what are there any other areas of the legislation that the administration would like to flag for us now so that we can begin the process of working with our advocates to address these questions? And in regards to reparations, we really want to make sure that we're not repeating dominant behavior that has systemically prevented Black folks from rising. And so the idea really is to create an opportunity for the commission to really have a strong voice leading what that work is going to look like. So just curious about how you envision that work in partnership.
Thank you, Counselor. I would like to also hear the rest of the questions and concerns, but I certainly will say that we are positioned and want to hear from everyone and understand how we can work this forward jointly relative to the dollars and cents, which is a valid question. I will be honest to say that detailed part of the work we have not explored yet, but again, today, our goal is to remain very clear and focused on all of the requests, all of your needs, all of your thoughts relative to this important work, and then how we move forward together. I also defer to my chief.
Yeah, just echoing what Chief Nelson has said. As you all know, we are still in the middle of the budget season, and we're just trying to explore what is possible right now. And also, I just want to hear from the advocates as to like what are some of the things that we can start working on right now versus midterm, long term, because I do hear you, and the way that we are defining equity, the action of correcting past harms is a part of the work, and so I am really looking forward to this conversation. So, but. There was a second question that I missed. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm just curious, and you know, and I appreciate that we're coming, you know, with an open mind. But I was really hoping that at least we could take some sort of just understanding of like any other pieces of the legislation as it's written now that you may, you know, you want to share, want to flag.
In full transparency, this would be just like thinking around the administration of administering or operations of a new commission, of a new office is something that we are really thinking about as a cabinet. How do we effectively run the work, the agenda that we're here to set? I just want to make sure that I am very clear on what people are hoping to achieve with what are the actual goals of the commission here that we can tap into now versus more of a long-term, not long-term, right? Like more of a midterm, et cetera, type of goal setting. And so I am with Chief Nelson here of like, I do really want to better understand where folks are at. Because for me as a chief of this particular cabinet, I need to make sure that whatever that we are setting like benchmarks and actual outcomes that we are reaching versus sort of just we're here, we're present. I want to actually get the work going. And so I want to hear from the advocates as like, what can we achieve today, tomorrow, 6 months, 12 months, 3 years? And so that's where I'm coming from.
Great. And Councilor, thank you for that. Councilor Luigi, and I'm going to defer the rest of my questions and wait because I know that Lori needs to leave and I want to make sure that my colleagues are able to ask any specific questions they have of her. Thank you. Thank
you, Councilor Mejia. We've also been joined by Councilor Fernandez Anderson, who is a co-sponsor for this ordinance. We've also been joined by Councilor Erin Murphy. So thank you to my colleagues for joining. I'm now going to turn it over to Councilor Fernandez Anderson as a co-sponsor here to ask questions of the administration. Why don't we go to Councilor Worrell, who is also here and is also a co-sponsor, if you have any questions for the administration.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Just one question. The way that, what is the difference between, or if there's any difference between it, the studies in the first half of the studies for the Reparations Commission being an RFP, opposed to it being $100 per hour? Is there any difference on that structure or how we are able to pay those that are giving us their time?
That I do not have the answer to that, but I actually would love to connect with Chief Shagun Idowu on this to get a sense of what that would look like if this is something that the activists would also consider.
That's all the questions I have for now. Madam Chair, you're on mute.
Thank you again, Councilor Worrell. Checking in to see if Councilor Fernandez Anderson is available to ask her questions. If not, I'll move on to the next, to my next colleague. Okay, I'm going to move on to Council President Ed Flynn. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the sponsors for bringing this forward. Thank you to the activists and to the city administration officials that are present here today. I'm listening, learning about the proposal, and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, President Flynn. Next up is Councilor Lydia Edwards. And whenever, Councilor Fernandez Anderson can have the floor whenever she's available, but next up for questions is Councilor Lydia Edwards.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to start off with first the question about the salary or the stipend or whatever we're going to call it. Are there any other commissions whose members are getting $100 an hour and capped at $50,000?
My understanding is no. The answer is no to that. But I can go ahead.
And so, back of the envelope math puts this at about, assuming they work every single week, 500 hours. So what 10 hours a week or something like that. This is not realistic. I don't expect the commission to work that much, but the max amount of this could cost is 15 members at $50,000 a year. What does that put us at 50? That's $750,000 a year, assuming that they max out at $50,000. And then you're also, the legislation is also including the hiring of an executive director. And there's also the commission when they turn around and hire an assistant director as well. So that could put this at well over or close to $1 million a year in order to operate the commission. So I think my question would be to the lead sponsors. Why do you think that this commission should be getting close to that level of budget when no other commission, including the commission I'm sitting on, which is to end family homelessness, we don't even get, I don't expect that the homeless members who are going to be on the commission would get that amount. So I think that's my first question, is why this is at this level of cost. I can go through all my questions and just kind of put, Madam Chair, I can do that and just kind of go through my questions and then leave it to folks to answer. We can go one by one.
Why don't you go through all of your questions?
Okay, so the first question then is to the lead sponsors. I would Councilor Mejia, Worrell, and Anderson Fernandez. Why $1 million a year for this particular commission, when I don't know that any other commission that's ever been created by this body or the mayor's office has a budget that high? I do know that, and then just for, you know, for people's purposes watching at home, we absolutely do provide stipends to commission members. We provide stipends to ZBA members so that people aren't going into poverty to provide their expertise. So that can include, you know, food, that could include, travel costs, things like that. You want to make sure that people aren't, but this seems awfully steep. Again, looking at the max amount. The other question I have is, why were specific organizations named in this ordinance? I tend to be cautious about naming specific organizations because, one, they're nonprofits, they change their names all the time. They're allowed to, they can merge, they can come together, they can be separate. So in terms of longevity stake, if you name a specific organization, this question is for the lead sponsors. I think it's safer to just name expertise, right? Because the organizations that were picked, one, I think you should be, you know, organizations that actually have a proven expertise in reparations in, and these organizations could, but there could be other ones that emerge. So maybe staying away from the names of specific organizations and actually put in, we want someone or an organization that can name some, or that, and not naming the organization that specifically has studied reparations. We want an organization that has specifically studied how modern day policing and you know, overseers from slave days are deeply connected. We want a commission that's specific, or a commission member, an organization that has done the following. So you're setting out the expertise that is required, not the organization. My biggest concern, again, is that organizations change, they merge, they end. And if you put the name in there, you're going to have to go back and amend the ordinance. Versus just call out what you want. You know, you want someone who has been about radical change and racial equity, an organization dedicated to that. Because it also it limits the pool, which is the second question I have.
I'm just going to ask you just for one more minute because Lori Nelson has to leave at 10:30. So I just want to make sure that everyone is able to also ask her questions if they would like. So. And then we can come back to you first at the second round of questions.
Sure. So then the other point is, then when you name specific organizations, why are they only then allowed to hire? And it seems more like a hiring a position of the executive director, of the assistant director, and then also naming who else gets to be the other commissioners. Why aren't the city council able to not just consult, but confirm who's going to be on the commission as well? You're giving specific organizations a lot of power over $1 million budget, and they're not elected. They could change their name, they could change whoever, and they don't have, like, I think you should prove the expertise that's required to sit at that table versus the organizations, because I don't know why they got picked or what favoritism and so on and so forth. It's 24 months to produce a report. After the report's produced, who is supposed to actually enforce it? We have a lot of reports that aren't enforced as it is with the fire department and so on and so forth. The subpoena power might be part of that, but I need to know what is the enforcement and what's the point of the report. And then finally, it looks like it's at least a 2-year report process, but how long are the commissioners appointed? I missed that. And again, when you're talking about $1 million budget, you're binding the city to multiple millions of dollars for a commission. And finally, to answer Worrell's question, what's the difference between an RFI and the $100 salary stipend? At least with an RFI, there would be going through our procurement process. And again, as it's been highly critical, we've been criticizing our procurement process because we don't include enough Black and brown people in that pool, but that's the major difference. It would at least go through that process. So those are all my questions, Councillor Muhajin. Most of them for the lead sponsors, none of which I'm willing to die on a hill for. I just want to know what is going on and why, and maybe there's certain things we can change. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Councilor Edwards. I'm gonna pass it over to Lori Nelson to answer, and then we'll wait on our colleagues to answer the rest of your questions, just so that we can get more councilors in there with questions for Lori Nelson. So Lori, I'm not sure if you have an answer to any of the questions that Councilor Edwards has asked.
Madam Chair, it seems like those questions were more pointed towards the lead sponsors. At least that's what I think as I took notes. So I'm just here listening, but I thank you, Councilor Edwards, for raising these issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, I see Tanya's hand up. My colleague, Councilor Fernandez Anderson, her hand is raised. So the floor is yours for questions at this moment.
Good morning, Madam Chair. I'm sorry I stepped away and then my team was telling me he was calling my name, so I apologize. I guess my questions for administration, and then quickly I will address one of the points that my colleague made.
Actually, can you wait on addressing the issues that Councilor Edwards raised, just so that we can get maximized time with Lori?
Absolutely. So I guess, just for some questions, just if the city or if the administration can respond to how they feel, do they have any data that pertains to how racial wealth inequity in Boston has been instituted, or the role that Red Line played, or just in terms of like health inequities and treatment and resources in the city, how has the city been able to address that? And do you feel that it's at an equitable point that we don't need any further interventions?
So thank you for that question. I apologize. Thank you for that question, or those questions, Counselor. So in reverse, certainly our collective goal is to continue to work towards a more equitable or inclusive city, right? And so we could surely argue that we have more work to do on all levels relative to the specifics as it relates to some of the work around the economic gaps and divides. I certainly would defer again to my colleague in chief, Segun Idowu, relative to the work that he is doing in his cabinet to close some of these gaps that we know have been part of the history of our city. And overall, certainly I would safely speak, I hope so, for my chief as well, when we both believe that part of this work, part of the work that we do is really to deal with these spaces that we're in now relative to inequity. Our goal is, again, as a administration, to move forward with an agenda that reflects the people we serve, but also to be very intentional on how we meet people where they are rather, and help to bridge some of these gaps that we know are part of what we're trying to dismantle across the city. But again, this is something that we have work to do, and we are committed to doing that work and try and move this forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chief Nelson. Sorry, how much time are you giving us, Madam Chair?
It's just that it's 10:29 and she has to hop off, but you can ask another question.
No, we'll be courteous to Chief Nelson. I'll reserve my questions for later if you like.
Thank you. I'll move on to Councilor Braden, if you have any questions for Chief Nelson.
No, I don't have any questions. I think, as you know from our work in our office, we're trying to get our heads around the number of boards and commissions we already have in the city of Boston. It's not to say that this particular commission isn't necessary, but I think we have over 450 boards and commissions in the city at the moment. And I think back to, in terms of looking at stipends, etc., for commissioners and folks on boards. I think it's a valid question to ask about compensation. So again, I'm really here to listen and learn. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Bach, any questions for the administration?
No questions for Lori, although it's a pleasure to see her. Lori and I used to work together at the Housing Authority. I would say I was pleased to be part of the hearing order we did last cycle on reparations with Councilor Mejia, and I feel like, we all know that the legacies of slavery endure in our city, and that the economic legacies of slavery endure in our city and in our institutions. And so I'm always sort of mystified when folks think we shouldn't be talking about all this, because it's kind of like, well, if the effects of it all were not being felt and seen in our city today, then maybe you could talk about it as some kind of disconnected ancient history, but it's just so obviously connected to the racial wealth gap, to the realities of everything, from policing to access to all kinds of opportunity. And so I'm really glad that we're having this conversation in the council. And I appreciate Councilor Mejia and other colleagues sort of like moving it to the next level and talking about like, what's next? How do we go from conversation to action? And I think that I would take Councilor Edwards's questions in the spirit of kind of, like making sure, I think whenever we talk about this topic, what we hear is that sense of the urgency of action, right? And the desire to make sure that we are on a like real action plan where people feel like there's actual repair and redress happening at the end of it. And so I think that we can acknowledge that that's kind of where we all want to get, and then have reasonable questions about, well, we don't want to just say that we have a reparations commission that sort of exists and therefore we've done reparations, when in fact we haven't gotten to that action point, right? So I think very interested in how we make this feel like a real pathway towards redress, but I'm very glad to be having this conversation today, and grateful, and looking forward to the advocates as well and hearing more from them. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thanks, Councilor Bach. Councilor Murphy, if you have any questions for the administration?
No, thank you, Chair, and I appreciate the questions my colleagues have already asked, and I'm here to listen and learn. So thank you very much. I have no questions at this time, maybe in the next round.
Thank you. I do have one question for you, Chief Nelson and Chief Solis Rivera. Have you looked at other cities who have been studying reparations and acting on reparations to have a good comparative lens on what works and what doesn't work, or is that something that you're looking to do? I think that could be a really great way for us to think about how to do this necessary work here in Boston.
Thank you for that question, Madam Chair. And please forgive me to the esteemed councilman and the panel and the sponsors. I will have to leave after this, but Chief Solis Rivera is here. I do know, based on just reparations on the whole and its movement, not only from House 40 relative to Congressman Clyburn down, certainly an illustration has been Evanston, Illinois, where they have lifted up different ways to look at reparations. I think that is a model that we could certainly consider studying and understanding as we move this forward. And I think that's one of the major cities. I do know of other cities that have looked at not the totality of a package of reparations, but certainly pulling out some of the inequities that some of the counselors so outlined here on the call. But I do think that example is a key example.
Thank you. And thank you again for your time. Sorry to everyone that it was compressed, but time constraints, and I'm sure this is the first of many conversations that we'll have on this issue. So hopefully we'll be able to schedule it in a time where we don't feel so tight, but I thank you for your time and your insight. And we look forward to working with the administration on this effort. So thank you.
Thank you.
Chief Solis Rivera, we have you until whenever. Okay, great. So what I'm gonna do now is we're gonna go again through all of my colleagues, and feel free to either make opening remarks or answer, especially to the lead sponsors and co-sponsors that were asked, or to ask additional questions of the administration. So I'll start with lead sponsor, Councilor Julia Mejia.
Yeah, thank you. And I also want to just make it known for the record that we worked in deep partnership with a lot of the organizations that were listed in the ordinance in the early stages, just to kind of give people some framework here. Over the last year or so, we have been in communication with the organizations that have been listed to help inform a lot of our thinking. And so in the spirit of making sure that we're leading with community, we were really intentional about naming those organizations that have been set. So it's less of a situation of favoritism, but more of the folks who have been at the table here in the city of Boston doing this work in different capacities. And so, but I do appreciate the spirit in which, and I understand Councilor Edwards' point in terms that organizations do change, leadership changes, you know, directions change. So I do appreciate the expertise comment and really welcome that feedback. So thank you for that. And then in regards to, you know, why is this particular commission getting paid as opposed to others? The question I think we should be asking is, why aren't other commissions getting paid? Why are we expecting people to show up and donate their time and participate? So I think there's something for us to wrestle with here in regards to how we engage community. I always see that those who are living the realities are usually the only ones at the table that are not getting paid. And then we have these big time consultants who are there in their official capacity, whether it be through work or consulting, that are getting compensated. So I think there's something for us to all learn when we're thinking about equity and justice and making sure that everybody is being compensated for their level of expertise. So that's just something that I want to uplift. And I think that as you hear from the advocates who worked on getting us here this far, you will be able to understand the why there is a need to ensure that folks are getting compensated to have a seat at the table and to inform our thinking. So with that, I think in the spirit of making sure that the chief has an opportunity to hear from my other colleagues, I just kind of wanted to address those two main points that Councilor Edwards in particular raised, and I really do appreciate that feedback. And this is what this is it's a hearing, an opportunity for us to hear from both our colleagues and the administration and learn, so that when we do dive into the working sessions, we're able to fine tune the language in a way that's going to get us to where I hope we all want to be, is creating an opportunity for Boston to repair the harm and to ensure that we have a commission specifically designed to do just that. So with that, I'll kick it over to back to you, Chair, so that you can call on some of the other lead sponsors and the rest of my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. I'll now call on Councilor Fernandez Anderson. If you have any questions or opening remarks or wanted to respond to anything that was stated, just because of the rush nature of the first half hour, I just want to make sure we go through everyone again.
I think that, thank you, Madam Chair. I think that Councilor Mejia covered some of the points that I wanted to make. And I thank you for sharing that opinion. I also feel that I understand in the interest of time in running a committee, and I plan on learning from you, Madam Chair, in how I execute or facilitate, so that we can, with constraints of time, so that we can get the best out of our time and be effective. The other sentiment that I have from this is a lot of anxiety building up. This is a topic that profoundly impacts people that are not necessarily in the room, and hopefully in the waiting room, waiting to testify. And as an African woman, of course, impacted by transatlantic slave trade, but we're talking about today about the African American people and whatever systems that impact others, right? Black and brown people, secondary. And so at least that is my position. So I believe that this process should be patient, should be one that is reflective, should be one that is considerate, and should be gentle and should be forgiving to one another, so that we can address this issue in its proper context, but also with heart and more than just bureaucratic delay tactics or nuances that we're trying to create so that we can argue our points for the people that we represent. So I'm here to have an open mind. I don't want to be judgmental with any of the ignorance that I'm going to hear or possibly hear, I'm speaking for myself when I say, I am taking a seat, I am listening, and I am taking notes, and I am very serious about this process because it's one that's very near and dear to my heart. So that is all I have to say. No judgment. I'll reserve my opinions, and hopefully we are being honest and sincere about what this is so that we can actually really talk about the logistics of deciding on a commission or not, or how it should play out. Thank you so much for holding this.
Thank you so much, Councilor Fernandez Anderson. Yes, and I hope that in the next time that we have a hearing, we find a date and a time where there aren't these constraints so that we can have, you know, a lot more questions answered and consideration paid to the depth and weight of this, you know, important topic of repairing harm. Next up is Councilor Worrell. If you had any additional questions or comments, you don't have to, or opening statements, you don't have to feel like you have to speak, but just wanted to open the floor up again since the first half hour felt rushed.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And just echoing some of the same things that my colleagues have said, you know, we have the ability to repair with targeted reparations to a community that has been intentionally oppressed, disadvantaged, and disenfranchised. So I personally just look forward to not just the hearings and the working sessions, but using this also as an opportunity to not only bring the conversation, but the process to those, you know, to the African Americans that have been affected by past and current conditions. So I believe that this needs to be a public process. When I say public, not just working sessions and hearings, but to have the voices of the community and the experts at the same table. And I also wholeheartedly believe that this should be led and be a process that's be led and activated by community members. That's going to be, you know, the beneficiaries and those who have been affected.
Thank you very much, Councilor Worrell. Council President Ed Flynn, if you had any questions or additional remarks that you wanted to make.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't have any further comments or questions. The only thing I would add is I'm looking forward to hearing from community members, but also learning more about this from my colleagues on the council as well. So I think learning from my colleagues on the council will be helpful to me. So just want to say thank you to the sponsor and the lead sponsors, and to you, Madam Chair, as well, and to the administration officials. Thank you.
Thank you, Council President Ed Flynn. And also just want to remind folks that my colleagues to feel free to also continue to ask the administration questions. Chief Solis Yvette is still here and available to answer questions. Turning back to you, Councilor Lydia Edwards, not sure if you felt like you had more questions that you wanted to ask during the first round. So
Sure. Sure, and I think it is interesting, and when I just realized that I think I'm the only African American we have on the city council, and the only person who would be able, would benefit from some of the reparations, if that's how we're defining it for a narrow population. I'm interested to see what we would do or think about reparations and for who. I am African American. I can tell you the slave ancestors I come from in this country. But I don't come from Boston. So that's another question I would have, is the reparations conversation only for African-American descendants of slaves in the city of Boston, from the city of Boston, that can trace their ancestry back to slavery in Boston. So these are questions that I think, and rightfully, we don't have to answer them. The commission could. The commission could easily say, it's going to be this narrowly, this population. It's going to be anybody who is perceived as having been part of the legacy of slavery, because, just because you are not directly descended from slaves here, you certainly could experience the racial oppression from that, because you are perceived as being from the racial oppression from slavery. You certainly were redlined. You were certainly, and you can talk about how redlining is part of the vestige of slavery and so on and so forth. So I am very interested in how it's defined, which therefore, makes me even more concerned about the fiscal responsibility of this commission. We can't not do it right. We can't not be something so well. And I just don't see how close to $1 million a year for an undefined amount of time, because I assume the commission's going to exist for as long as reparations are needed, which we know it's not like we're going to be like, okay, cool, this is the price tag and this is the moment. I am concerned that if we really want to just go ahead and make this permanent and have $1 million budget, just create the office. Because this commission is hiring people. This commission is paying themselves salaries of up to $50,000, and then hiring an executive director. And all of this without oversight from us, because it says we shall consult. It does not say that we shall confirm. I'm actually going to probably push the hardest on the defined organizations. Though I heard from Councilor Mejia, and I appreciate that, if we were to massage it to defined expertise, that's fine. But I think the price tag is something that, if you want this to be a permanent structure of the city of Boston that lasts forever, just create the office outright. The reason why commissions are different and why they're not paid is because it's assumed to be volunteer. It's assumed to be, yes, certain amount of expertise, but they're not supposed to be doing the work of city employees. It's supposed to be finite, kind of give you some thoughts and ideas, do a report or something, and walk away. This conversation seems a little bit more permanent. So I wonder if that's the conversation we should be having, is just creating an office dedicated to truth, reconciliation, and reparations. And of course, grounded in this particular group of African Americans, but you can speak to other groups that also need truth, reconciliation, and reparations. So I'd rather just have the conversation about an office with a real budget of $1 million a year than to try and work around through a commission. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Councillor Edwards, so much for your thoughts and your additional questions. We're going to have a lot more time to flesh out these questions and comments, hopefully during our next panel, and during the lifetime of what is going to be a conversation that lasts for the very reasons that you mentioned. Next, for any questions or additional comments or remarks, Councillor Braden.
I have no further remarks at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bach, anything? No pressure, but.
No, I think I'm fine, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Murphy.
I'm good, thank you.
All right, well, thank you, everyone, and thank you. I don't know if Councillor Mejia, did you have additional questions for the administration?
No, I just want to make sure that Chief is going to be staying on. We do have some advocates and we have some testimony too that is coming on, and would love to ensure that, Chief, I'm curious in terms of just some of the things that you have heard so far before we move over to our advocate panel and some testimony. Just curious. I mean, I think this is one of the things I always call policy making like sausage making, right?
Morcilla, sorry.
Morcillas, right? Like, we're all really about trying to figure out how we get to where we need to be. And this is why it's so important for us to have these conversations and to do so so publicly. So thank you to my colleagues who have provided some really great insight to some of the things that we should be exploring and thinking about. So, Chief, I don't want you to go. I want you to be here present with us, and also wanted to just kind of get your thoughts and initial reactions on some of the things that you've been hearing. And as you think about the equity work and you think about this moment in time here in the city of Boston in particular, just kind of like, I'd be curious to hear your reflections before we move on to the advocates. And I believe that my colleague, Councillor Fernandez-Anderson had her hand up, but then it went down. So I wasn't sure if she also had a question for the Chief. So Chief, just curious if you want to just your initial reactions, thoughts, and even comments or just suggestions. I mean, this is why we're all here today.
Well, first, I have it in my calendar that says I'm good until 11:30, and that's what I had in the calendar. Is that still the time for this team? If not, I can send some meetings to shift my next meeting. Is 11:30 still where we're?
Yeah, normally the way council hearings are usually blocked for like a 3-hour block time. So if you had it until 11:30, there is a possibility, depending on kind of what how many folks we have lined up, it might be a little bit longer. So you may want to send that email out right now.
Okay. Yeah, let's do, I can do 12.
Yeah, I imagine 12, well, at least till 12, so.
Okay, I'll send the message after my quick just reactions. First, I want to just stay with a comment that was shared earlier around how this process is about heart. And as a light-skinned Latina that does not know the experience of the Black American community here, right? Doesn't matter how much I read, doesn't matter how much I immerse myself in the community, I will never know what that means. And so I want to sit with that for a little bit longer. So thank you, Councillor Anderson, for that. I think, and this has been said by multiple folks today, of the way I'm seeing this, and I know that this is not what the council is asking for, right? It's almost like, let's wait until the recommendations come out for 2 years, whereas we are thinking about home ownership. We are thinking about, right, like investing in our small Black businesses. We are thinking, right, we've just launched an Office of Black Male Advancement, and I'd be curious to see where Director Farrow can take a lot of the work, can address a lot of the work that directly impacts wealth building and the well-being of the African American community. And so that's sort of where I said earlier, I want to hear from the community members that have been doing this work for a long time, of like, what are some of those things that we need to be doing now, that we're already thinking about doing, that we're not thinking about doing, before there's even a conversation of like a larger study, a report or something like that. That's sort of where I've been sitting. So I just want to say that out loud, but thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Mejia, are you all set?
Yeah, no, I think that it's important for us to recognize that the way we envision this, just so everybody's really clear, is that the work in terms of who gets it and who doesn't, that we are really super intentional about making sure that this is led by the people. And to Councilor Worrell's point, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in the community so that they can define for themselves. And so our role and our hope is that that work will be led by the folks who get appointed. So I just want to be super clear about that process. But I think it's important for us to, if there are other council colleagues that have questions, to share their questions now. And if not, let's move over to the advocates chair.
I thought Councilor Fernandez-Anderson had her hand up. The floor is yours if you still have questions or a comment that you wanted to make.
Thank you so much for allowing me more time. I'll be quiet. Thank you, Councilor Mejia. You seem to be reading my mind. I was going to say, Chief Cervera, if you can please stay. And I would have hoped for the other people to stay as well. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the testimony of the community.
Awesome. Thank you, Councilor Fernandez-Anderson. And thank you for staying, Chief Solis Rivera. I'll just say that as a Black woman who lives here in the city of Boston, I'm really glad that we're having this conversation around reparations and repairing the harm, that we're also having it from like a historical perspective. Oftentimes Boston is overlooked when we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade. We think about Southern states and we don't think about how in the early 1600s, slave trade was dominant here in Boston and in New England. When we talk about what undergirds capitalism and how our merchants were able to build wealth, and wealth building, how dependent it was on free labor, right? That's what slavery was, free labor that killed. And so we have a responsibility to reconcile with that history, to bring out truth to all of our neighborhoods, to bring that truth so that we can finally get to a place of repair and harm. I think people often look, and I hope the administration takes this conversation seriously, because one of the reasons that people oppose reparations is because they don't know what it's about, really. They also oppose it because they always jump to the, well, we can't pay for that, it's too expensive, without staying in the uncomfortability that sometimes exists for people, especially for non-Black folks who are discomforted by the conversation around reparations and regarding who merits it. And so I think I really appreciate, what I hope this will do is to really help to break up that conversation of the moral argument around why we have a responsibility to repair the harm of how wealth was built in the city, to talk about how the government was an active player, both in the perpetuation of slavery and all of the things that came thereafter that really helped cement the stymieing of wealth building in Black communities. And so I'm hoping that we don't limit ourselves at any point to how we think about reparations, but that we can think about it both as a direct money transfer, but also as a community development and economic development tool. So happy to hear that we're also talking about the Office of Black Male Advancement. Happy to hear that we're also bringing in the Office of Economic Inclusion, if I think I'm getting the name right, for the new office, Opportunity and Inclusion, because all of these things have to work together while also realizing the need for an independent body that is really just thinking about reparations. And so while they can work together, the historic aspect of reparations must also be treated that way, very separately, in my opinion, from the other offices that are working on targeted policy solutions that sometimes address race directly and sometimes don't, that sometimes include the issue of repairing harm and sometimes don't. So there's incredible value to an office that is just, or to a commission or wherever this conversation leads us, that is addressed at that truth and that reconciliation and that repairing of the harm. So happy to hear that we'll potentially bring in a bunch of different players and that we can also look to supporting this commission in office as it is currently being proposed. So with that, I'm going to move on to our next panel of advocates, and a happy Chief Solis Yvette that you'll be able to stay on at least for some time. Our next panel of advocates is going to be Dr. Jemadari Kamara, Yvette Modister, and Dr. Raymond Winbush. So just one moment as I make sure that everyone is on and ready. Okay, next we are going to, the first one up will be Dr. One moment, please, okay, Dr. Jemadari Kamara, who I believe, oh, there you are. Thank you, Dr. Kamara, you now have the floor for opening remarks, and then I'll move on to the next panelist, and then my council colleagues who will have questions and comments. So thank you so much for taking your time to be with us here this morning for this very important, very refreshing, very, as I said, a moral conversation about what is owed, what is due, how we repair harm, and how we bring truth to the city of Boston. So thank you for being here, and you now have the floor.
Thank you very much, Councilor Louis-Jean and Councilor Mejia and all of the other councilors who are here present. I have had an opportunity this morning to sit in on most of the earlier commentary. And first, let me thank you for this opportunity to speak with you. And as opposed to perhaps dealing with some opening remarks that I had prepared, I'd like to address some of the commentary that I heard. I was, in fact, very pleased to hear the seriousness with which you're considering this issue and the depth of the questioning that was going on this morning. And there are several of those questions that I'd like to address in the just my opening remarks. The issue of truth and reconciliation that has been raised, and I understand the council has addressed some of those questions in the form of both hearings before and I think a commission that was set up. One of the dynamics of truth and reconciliation is that this process is one that has been engaged internationally. In a number of different places around the world. The question of truth and reconciliation has come to the table. But it is, out of those experiences, it is the intersection of truth and reconciliation that must pass through a point of intersection of repair, which is why in many cases, those processes have failed. And that point of intersection of repair is called the question of reparation. Reparations is that tool of public policy that helps us engage the process of repair. I heard the comments of Councillor Anderson, very sensitive comments regarding patience, the need for forgiveness, being non-judgmental in a process. And it is that process that we are looking to engage in the form of this commission that we're asking the council to consider. We all would like to get to that point of some action in an immediate form. But the notion of our ordinance that we are asking you to consider is to have the patience to work with us in community, we with you in city government, to engage in this process, which will be a long-term process. We're not going to resolve this next week. I would love to, by Christmas, set a deadline, and we're going to have all this worked out. Unfortunately, it won't happen that way. And it is by thoughtfully engaging this process, you as the leadership, the elected leadership of our community, can help us. Because unfortunately, it's my considered opinion that even with your enlightened leadership, the city council will not be able to solve this question. That this is going to require us taking leadership, but also inclusively engaging the responsibility of the private sector, of the nonprofit sector, of institutions that were also beneficiaries of all of the consequences of unpaid labor, like the church, like nonprofit institutions in our city, including the foundation. We have a much broader purview, but you are sitting at that point of leadership that can help us to open up a conversation that is thoughtful in a non-binary way. We need to consider this issue, particularly the question of the racial wealth gap that has existed. We all know the color of wealth study and the consequences of the disparity that exists. But the opposite, the other side of that, is that there's enormous opportunity, because that represents the opportunity for us to expand the possibilities of that creative wealth, to expand the product, the gross domestic product of our city, in that lost wealth that could be applied. This is not a zero-sum opportunity. This is not that, well, we're going to have to take from one community to give this to another. That's not what this is about. This is about expanding and opening up the creative opportunity for our community to expand and to grow by utilizing that more creatively, more industriously, to expand and enhance the wealth of our entire community here in Boston. The issue of the payment of commissioners has come up, and the potential maximum of $50,000 being paid to commissioners as a stipend for their work. Key to the whole conception of unpaid labor as having been the basis of the issues and concerns that we're confronting require us, if nothing else, then morally, that there is a considered stipend for the work of those commissioners that is being put in. The groups that have been identified as core to the commission are groups that have been working on this for years. The NAACP is only 100 and I forget now, 10, 15 years. I don't think they're going to go away. The University of Massachusetts is not going to go away. These groups have been involved as long distance runners in this and are anchored in our community. The nominations that will come from this come to the council. They will then go to the mayor's office. They will be confirmed by you. There are recommendations that will be coming forward. But it is out of the commitment and, in fact, anchoring the stability of the commission is why these particular groups were identified as being at the core of the commission to, in fact, deal with the very concerns that were being raised by the Council for Stability and long-term consideration in a process of engagement. The options that were looked at, one of the models that was raised was a consideration of the model in Evanston. There are other models, commissions in other parts of the country that have already been established that are considering issues appropriate for their communities. And we should look at those. We should consider those. But I think it is very important for us in Boston to understand that we are sitting uniquely by virtue of our historical position in the 21st century at the nexus of what America will look like in 2040, 2050. We currently represent demographically, structurally, in terms of our economy, where our country will be in several decades, and the kind of opportunities that we are able to define, the ways in which we are able to grapple with this issue that our society has not been able to grapple with, can set the tone and the direction for the future. Yes, we need to look at other models, other communities, what they have done, the lessons learned, but we will be modeling for others in our country the national policy that in fact grew out of the history of the policy recommendation put forward in 1988 by Senator Bill Owens in the state legislature here, is the model for HR 40, which is now being considered in the House of Representatives. We will be modeling in the city of Boston the way in which our nation can go and grapple with this issue in the future. And so while we look to others, I think we also need to look at how do we unleash the creative forces and energy in our community to establish a process that can give direction for the rest of the country and for our community for the future. I can hold the rest of my comments for right now. There are others on the panel whom I would like to have heard. And if there are any questions, take those up in your question period.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamara. I really, am I pronouncing your last name correctly, Kamara?
Correct. Absolutely.
Yes.
Thanks.
Dr. Kamara, for your incredible insights. I was wanted to call time, but you were sharing such insight with us. There'll definitely be time for more conversation when all the panelists are done and when the counselors are asking questions. I'd also like to note that we've been joined by my council colleague, City Councilor Kendra Lara. When we're going through our City Council questions, Councilor Lara, you'll have the floor to ask questions or make comments. Next up is Yvette Modister from the National African American Reparations Commission. She's a commissioner there. So Yvette, you now have the floor. Let me make sure that you are here and are able to. Well, while we work to get her here, I can turn the floor over to Dr. Raymond Winbush, who is the director of the Institute for Urban Research at Morgan State University.
Well, good morning from Baltimore, everyone. It's good to be here, and thank you for inviting me as someone who has written a couple of books on reparations. I'm going to be very, very disciplined and read my statement because I have a tendency to go off, especially with some of the things I've heard this morning about the issue of reparations. So this statement is about 3 to 4 minutes long.
Perfect. You have 5. There are really generally there's like 5 minutes for openings, so feel free to take more time. And then again, we'll have more dialogue, and you'll be able to obviously speak more. So thank you so much for your diligence.
Thank you. Thank you. Most of the members on this call are sitting just 4 miles and 240 years away from where Belinda Royale Sutton, an enslaved woman on the Ten Hills Plantation in Medford, Massachusetts, dictated her famous petition for reparations. She had been enslaved 70 years by Isaac Royal, the initial and primary donor to establish the Harvard Law School. Her petition was dictated to one of two possible people. Primus Hall, buried just 5 miles from where most of us are on this call are now sitting, in Copp's Hill Burying Ground. Hall was the founder of the first Black Masonic Lodge in the United States. The other possible scribe of Belinda's petition was poet Phyllis Wheatley, who is buried just a few feet away from Primus Hall in that same graveyard. To its credit, the Massachusetts State Legislature granted Belinda and her daughter 15 pounds, 12 shillings per year for the rest of her life, which was approximately $3,700, an enormous sum in that day. However, that same legislature never paid her after that first year. Belinda is still owed. A little further from where most of us now is the case of Elizabeth Mumbette Freeman, the first documented petitioner for reparations in the United States and the step-grandmother of W.E.B. Du Bois from Burlington, Massachusetts. There is a straight and uninterrupted historical line for compensatory justice running from America's past to the present. Freeman asked attorney Thomas Sedgwick, the fourth grandfather to actress Kyra Sedgwick, to sue for her freedom in 1780 after hearing the Massachusetts Constitution read aloud. She was illiterate and set in motion a 240-year history of Africans in America seeking compensatory justice for their enslavement. Along with Brom, an enslaved male who was also, quote, owned by John Ashley, the case of Brom and Bet versus Ashley was not only won by the two Africans, but the jury awarded them 30 shillings for unpaid work, the equivalent of $367 in today's currency. Given that a day's laborer's wages were 33 cents a day in 1781, Bet and Brom were awarded the equivalent of 3 years of work, a tidy sum for that time. Yes, the legacy of enslavement is all around Massachusetts and Boston, as it is in the rest of the United States. It's not just in statues, buildings, the names of schools and streets, but like a virus, it is buried deep in the body politic of the nation. It infects how intergenerational trauma of separated families still lingers in Boston in kinship patterns. It infected how money was lent, mortgages were granted, land was sold, and Black people policed. A commission in Boston that studies how these lingering effects impacts Boston's African community is much needed. And I urge the council, like other cities are doing, to take up this challenge and begin the process of racial healing. And I want to add in the minute I have left, that there are several cities. There are several cities in the United States that are, studying the issue of reparations and have commissions. We just completed a major funded study for Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser has ordered a study of reparations for the city. Asheville, North Carolina as well. Burlington, Vermont, up in New England. And the largest commission that is at the state level presently is in California, where Governor Gavin Newsom has commissioned a major study on reparations, and that report is due, I believe, in July. So you would be joining and hopefully pioneering a major work that needs to be done. I've been running back and forth to Boston over the past 5 years because I'm trying to locate Belinda's grave, because I wrote a book entitled Belinda's Petition. And we think that she's buried in that same graveyard where Phyllis Wheatley is. So do the work and you will not regret it. And some of the ills that are in the Boston right now will be cured by understanding the past of the city. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Winbush, for those comments. Really appreciate them. Just checking to see is.
Yeah, Councillor Louis-Jean, I've been informed that Yvette is now in the attendees list.
Okay.
Or she may need to be brought over.
Awesome. Just added her. So can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Awesome.
Let me, I don't know why you can't see my video. Hold on, let me. And let me just change. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Thank you so much for being with us, Yvette.
Let me
You now have the floor.
Thank you. Apologies for all the tech stuff. Good morning. Giving thanks to those whose shoulders I stand on, I want to dedicate my time and words to my mentor, Boston City Councilor Chuck Turner, and to Senator Bill Owens. Good morning, Madam Chair, and to all the city councilors and Chief Sevilla for being here. A special thank you to Councilor Mejia, Councilor Fernandez-Anderson, and Councilor Worrell for bringing us here. I also had this whole thing prepared like Dr. Jimadari Kamara, but want to use the time to go to the heart as Councilor Fernandez-Anderson spoke. For almost 7 years, I spent my Saturday mornings at the First Church in Roxbury, being one of the advisory council members of City Councilor Chuck Turner. And I was always amazed, no matter what the weather, elders in the community came because they wanted to be heard, and they knew that Chuck and other city councilors and other politicians would be there. These years were my real education of what organizing looks like and how to meet the community where they're at. As a founding NARC commissioner, which I'm no longer now, as a founding NARC commissioner, I traveled the country to hear from African Americans, people of African descent, line up in Atlanta, in New York, in New Jersey, in New Orleans to share their stories. My time in New Orleans will forever be with me. Folks lined up to speak their truth of the displacement they experienced after Katrina and the lasting impact of Hurricane Katrina till today. Some of you have seen me in different spaces in Boston, but my common theme is, and I'm the founder and director of Encuentro Diaspora Afro, who has been on the streets of Boston for 25 plus years. The common theme is seeking the liberation of people of African descent and the self-determination to define and speak up and tell their story. I was a part of Dr. Atia Martin's incredible report, Resilient Boston, an Equitable and a Connected City. I was amazed then that in the 2000s, many folks spoke of the pain of the busing area as if it was yesterday. We need to heal that pain. Just last week, the CBS report shared that Boston is the third most expensive place to live, and those most impacted are the Black community. The median cost of one-bedroom apartment in the city is $2,666, while a two-bedroom average is $2,990. The national median of one bedroom is $1,400. In the 2015 study, as we've heard on the wealth gap, we found the median net worth for white household in Greater Boston was $250,000, and for Black families, it was just $8. After that report came out, our own chief, current chief, Chief Segun Idowu, called an emergency meeting for Black Bostonians to come to the table. And the whole, I'm quoting him from his own interview, the whole entire meeting was, we've got to do something about this. This is a state of emergency, and we need to talk about a solution. My closing remarks at the hearing in November was to highlight the first case brought forward in Massachusetts by an African-American woman, Belinda Sutton, who my colleague and friend Ray Winbush spoke of and wrote the book, Belinda's Petition. And I want to read, because when we talk about the money and who gets paid and the issues of labor, as he wrote, historically, the complete and total appropriation of Black women's domestic, manual, and reproductive labor served to firmly establish the economic foundation of the United States. The use of their bodies to reproduce the slave labor ensured the continuing viability of the Southern slavery after the U.S. officially abolished the transatlantic slave trade in 1808 by generating a labor force perpetrated independently of the need to import new slaves from Africa, a labor force born into the slave system as opposed to imported into it. This is unfinished business in America. Lingering effects in Boston, such as education, housing, and mass incarceration, to name a few, are ongoing. The ongoing disparities are vestiges of enslavement. Enslavement lives through these vestiges, including everything post-Civil War, lynching, voter suppression, Jim Crow, segregation. Healed in earnest from the trauma, it is time to shift the consciousness. It's time for an apology and to begin moving in the direction to make things right. We speak of equity, now it's time to act on it. All Black Bostonians, first and foremost, African Americans who can trace their land harmed by this truth, should be a part of this conversation. The Reparations Commission would take the time to truly look at the history and the current situation of a resilient Black Boston community. It's about restoration and accountability. If we strive to become a better city that sees all of its citizens as equal, then we should all be saying reparations now. Boston has a rich history of the African-American struggle and the impact of Boston. We want to raise that up. It is time to face this ugly truth and make it right.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you to Yvette Modister. Thank you to Dr. Kamara. Thank you to Dr. Winbush for your insight to making the connections about repairing the harm, about a resilient Black Boston, about connecting it to the symbol to the real economic harm derived from free labor, rooted in the exploitation of Black people in the city, in this country, and around the world. So I really do, as a Black woman, as a person born of Haitian descent, first successful slave revolt and what that meant to the world, and how we continue to fight for our liberation today in 2022. I am incredibly grateful that we are having this conversation in the halls of government. And so thank you for being here. I am now going to turn it again to my colleagues in government to ask questions or comments to any of the remarks that have been made. We'll first turn it over to lead sponsor, City Councilor Julia Mejia.
Yeah, thank you, Councilor. Chair Louis-Jean, I am so incredibly grateful to our panelists for centering us, and also wanted to just acknowledge my incredible sister in service, Councilor Tanya Anderson Fernandez, who always really centers us, Fernandez Anderson, excuse me, always centers us in what this work is really all about. You know, I always say that this is not hard work, this is heart work. And sometimes the hard work is the hardest to do, because it really forces us to shift our thinking and brings us to a very uncomfortable space, but that's where we need to sit in this moment in time. So I really do appreciate my colleague for centering us in that. I just have a few questions. You know, when we first filed this ordinance, our office phones were blowing up. Everybody wanted to know what our vision as counselors was for reparations. And we would always push back and say that it wasn't about us in terms of what our vision was, that we really took the lead from the two co-authors that are here, Dr. Kamara and Yvette Modister in particular, to really draft up this deep community with folks who have been on the ground doing this work much longer than our office, any of our offices have been, right? So really understanding that this specific piece of legislation that we put forth was in partnership with community. And I think that oftentimes there is this idea that we always have all the answers. And I think what we're trying to do as offices is really change oftentimes the way we do business. And really what leadership is about is stepping to the side and creating space for the real folks who are doing the work to also lead, you know? So with that, I'm just curious, would any of you be willing to talk a little bit about the distinction between the role our offices have played as legislators and your work as advocates?
Dr. Kamara, you want to go first, and then
Yes.
I'll follow.
The rationale for establishing the commission in the way in which we articulated it in the proposed ordinance is inclusive of a set of core organizations who have been advocating for these policies over a series of years. The New Democracy Coalition, we have the NAACP, King Boston, as well as Encuentro Diaspora Afro, and the expertise of the Africana Studies Department at UMass Boston. It is these core groups that have been advocating both in community organizations, community spaces, as well as through the academy in articulating the concerns that people in our communities have had over the years. This is not a new issue. It is coming to the forefront now at this historical moment in unity and in collaboration in order to formalize this in using the public policy structure of city governance in order to be able to put forward a reasoned approach for our city to address these. So it is in collaboration with the instruments of public policy that we are choosing to use a commission structure. While there are concerns across the board that have been expressed, because it is not, while standing on the historical grounds and concerns that we have had, this is manifest in a series of public policy consequences with regard to housing, with regard to education, with regard to mental health, with regard to health disparities that are now created a complex and interlinked set of policy concerns that if we are to deal with the disparities outlined, we've seen articulated through the Federal Reserve report referred to by Yvette and others, we have to have a comprehensive approach moving forward in the process that Councillor Anderson talked about, a process that will engage these issues. And so it is working in solidarity with you as public officials and the use of public policy tools that we can begin to address this. But it is not solely exclusive to the public sector, because the private sector also holds responsibility. The nonprofit institutions in our communities, the church must be held accountable. The foundations in our community who have extraordinary wealth, non-taxable wealth. We're sitting in a community whose economic engine rests upon more than 60 institutions of higher education, nonprofit tax-exempt institutions that have endowments, some of which are larger than the city's money. We need to question that. And they need to be challenged as well. So it is a complex issue. It is why we are proposing the use of a commission, certainly over this initial 24-month period to adequately begin to explore these, to come up with recommendations that are reasoned, that begin to direct us toward a comprehensive vision of the next steps that we would take going forward. Whether that is actually the establishment of an office that was suggested earlier by Councillor Edwards, it could be. Is it an independent structure? It could be, but it certainly must be guided and directed by those who have been challenged most directly by the question, first of all. Second of all, in order to move the work forward, we need to have a public apology for an acknowledgement of what has transpired up to this point to allow us then collectively to engage to move forward this question. And thirdly, understanding the interrelatedness of our experience here in Boston with those of others in other municipalities in the country, other states as referred to by Dr. Winbush, that are now considering these across the country. And we need to know that this is also happening internationally. Councillor Louis-Jean, you spoke about the experience of Haiti. And just as there is a national African-American Reparations Commission, there is a Caribbean Reparations Commission that is challenging the governments of France, of England, of Holland, Dutch, in their experience. It was a global experience that brought us to these shores. But one boat simply happened to have stopped in Haiti, the next in Panama, the next in Jamaica, and another one in Virginia. And the boats were owned, they were insured, they were banked by people in Boston and Rhode Island, Connecticut. There's complicity throughout an interlinked system. And that is the approach we need to have to address this in a long-term manner through our public sector and our other institutions, along with the community act.
I have one more question, just in the interest of making sure that my colleagues also go. So thank you for that, Dr. Kamara, for being so eloquent. You know, I always talk about the elephant in the room, right? That there's so many things happening that we don't name. And I'm just curious, you know, which is this whole idea of reparations in Boston, you know, we know it has received some serious backlash, with a lot of people saying that the need for reparations is in the past and that we should just move on, or that we fought a civil war and that was our reparations. I mean, I'm just curious about what are your thoughts on these arguments, and what would you say to someone who expresses those beliefs?
I wanted to jump in, Julia, thank you for that question. And thank you, Baba Jimadari, for your words, and also for Ray for his expertise. You know, I think there's room for all those conversations. The conversation is very layered. But as I said in my words, it's, you know, I wanted to bring us to Boston, to the everyday. You know, this is stuff that we're dealing with every day. You know, for the last 2 years, the world, Boston, has had the same two conversations: COVID and racism and Black Lives Matter. And in that, we saw the disparities of who is most affected. So it hasn't gone away. We haven't repaired the damage. The system is still functioning in a way that does not humanize the African-American, Black people, people of African descent experience in whatever shade you show up. In whatever shade you show up, that we need to have that conversation. It is a real conversation. Those numbers around housing, you know, as soon as COVID was lifted, we're seeing numbers and summers people getting evicted in our streets of Boston because what they're making doesn't suit what they have to pay out. So do not say that we have resolved this. You know, there are those that say, oh, we have resolved this, you had a Black president, or we have resolved this, we have Black politicians. No, we have not resolved this, because we are still suffering. Our families are still suffering. Our people are still suffering. People are not able to live where they want to live, to be around their families. Displacement is not just about home. Displacement is about the school. that supermarket that has the food you like, that family member that supports you for your childcare. So I think we need to, the intersectionality of this conversation is very profound and very deep. The mental and emotional damage that this has done to our community continues to linger on. So we are not talking about the past needs to be a part of the conversation. The apology needs to be a must, but we also need to have the conversation of what is happening now. Who are affected on these streets of Boston that we all live in? Who are the Black Bostonians that should have a seat at this table?
Thank you. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, just real quick. I have a colleague of mine that says that we may well be called the United States of amnesia. We really want to forget. And there's a process right now in place in the United States. We're seeing the banning of books, not talking about the past. And in fact, if you do talk about the past, you're considered part of critical race theory, which is also misnamed. So, I think that this idea that somehow we should move along and think about, the future rather than the past, we don't say that about the Alamo. We don't say that about the 4th of July. We don't say it about anything in our past, except when it comes to the worst institution that ever plagued this country, which was enslavement. Just wanted to add that.
Thank you for that. I'm going to kick Chairwoman Lydia, I'm going to reserve the rest of my time for my colleagues, just because I want to make sure that while we have the chief here, she's able to engage in the conversation. So thank you. That's it for me.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you, Dr. Winbush, for those comments. I think they were, I received them very well. I'm going to turn it over to another sponsor, Councilor Fernandez-Anderson, for any questions or comments you may have.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Dr. Kamara, I appreciate your graciousness in all of your comments and relating to my comments earlier. I assure you they're not from me, but anything good that comes out of my mouth is to credit our creator, and anything bad, you can definitely hold me accountable. I look to be a part of this, and I guess just reiterating, I don't have any questions particularly for the panel. I'm anxiously waiting to hear public testimonies from folks as well. So I'll keep this short, but my comment is just to reiterate that that we are honest about our own biases or our own inferior complex that we may harbor, our own issues that we are dealing with as we make space. I think that the intersectionality in human beings is a very common one, and that is that we're all the same, and we all want to be loved and to belong and to prosper. We all fight to pay, to live, and to raise our children and to survive. And so when we get to a point where a city like Boston, that we have to have conversations about paying a commission to do a study that is long overdue, when we get to a point where we're having this conversation and there are still those who will question us, will say that it's not possible, that it's too much, to Councilor Louis-Jean's point, that they will question the fact that, what is this? It's over the top. And so I just applaud those who have come before us, before this hearing, doing this work, paving the way with their blood, sweat, and tears, and their sacrifice and their genius. And I appreciate you. And I look forward to really discussing logistics for this commission. And I think that the whole point is so that the commission can turn into a department, hopefully, right? So let's talk about those specifics. Is it a commission for a couple of years? And does that make sense? Do we go straight into a department, or essentially are we saying a commission that will eventually turn into a department? Either way, the folks in the city, we know that the city is not prepared because the city is not leading by example, and not to this mayor's credit, but to the ones previous. We can look at, and there's a hearing that's coming up on equity in the budget. We can look at how the city is leading with this, and we know that the city is not ready. What we're saying is, it doesn't matter if the city is not ready. This is something that must happen, and so therefore let it be it. So I look forward to the work and the honest conversations about, again, our own biases and about our own superiority or inferiority complexes. I look forward to becoming uncomfortable and repairing our own divide and issues that we may have with this. I don't think that we need to be divisive. I think that even if we're uncomfortable and we have to cry or fight through this, this has to happen. It must happen. And that's just my only sentiment. I have no questions other than we already know that this needs to happen. Can we talk about the logistics? Can we just get it done and get this out of the way? It's too much talking. It's too long. It's too much suffering. It's too much pain and too much death and too much suffering. And we know the issue. Let's just be honest and let's just get it done.
Thank you so much, Councilor Fernandez Anderson, for your comments. I'm reserving mine, but I just want to say that oftentimes people will point, as you stated, as I had originally stated, people point to the cost of reparations as being really high. Well, it's because the violation, the harm done was really high and very expensive. And so we talk about the work of reparations, the work of repairing, we are talking about making people whole. And that first is, as I said before, it is a moral conversation. It is a conversation about how do we do right by our neighbors? It is a conversation about how do we live in a just society? And that's going to come with a dollar figure if we're talking about repairing harm. So I do want us to just be honest about that, which is why I think the historic element here and really exploring Boston's role is incredibly important. I'm going to move on. A lot of my colleagues have left. Next on the list was Council President Ed Flynn, who I don't see here. Councilor Edwards, Councilor Braden, you have the floor for any questions or comments.
Chair, I just wanted to note that Councilor Morell is also one of the lead.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. That is true. My apologies, Councilor Braden, because especially Councilor Morell is a co-sponsor here. You have the floor, Councilor Morell, if you have any comments or questions for the panelists.
First and foremost, just want to say thank you to the panelists for all your work around advocating for our community and your studying your insight. It's really shown through today in your speaking. Just wanted to ask one question, and I know as Boston, we should be leaders, right? To Dr. Kamari's point, we should be leaders in this area. So, but I just want to also just looking across the city, I believe there's a few cities across our country that have established a reparations. Are there any best practices that we can do right now to continue to engage our community around this conversation that you've seen throughout the country? With this conversation ongoing, are there any best practices that you have seen on how we can get more people excited, more people engaged in this conversation around reparations?
Yes, let me just briefly address that, and perhaps other panelists would have other examples. You will note that in the structure of the ordinance, one of the processes that will occur is that with the commission, there will be a series of hearings that would be held around the city. These hearings will not only be to share information about the challenge of the commission and its intent to develop the report, but to gather information, to gather stories, to gather feedback and experiences that people in our community have had across the city. And to be able to incorporate those stories, to build archives of information that would help to enhance the quality of the report and understanding of the experiences and so that the commission itself can actually be a voice of the experience of those in our community. While yes, there will be an academic arm and studying the specific consequences of the experience with regard to wealth building and housing and so forth. But the human element of this will come through that process. It is an interactive one that we expect. And this is what has happened in some of the other communities that we will certainly want to learn from. But the actual outcomes will be very unique to the structure of our community. We are not structured like some of the other cities. The reasons why people are here, the economic base of our city is unique, and we need to then be able to apply those experiences to the uniqueness of our circumstance that will help us in crafting the outcomes of the report. Perhaps some of my colleagues might have other experiences we could learn from.
I just wanted to add that, thank you for that question, Councilor Worrell, that, we can see, I saw the examples of California, we have the examples of Evanston, we are now seeing some of the movement in New Jersey. But, once again, it goes back to, where we started, what the chair woman has shared, what Councilor Fernandez Anderson has shared, is that, it has to be the community dictating this. Boston has its own unique history. I would hold to define what it should be without the community's voice, at the whole community voice at the table. So I think that's a conversation that can be answered once we move this forward and take this into the community, hear from the community. Boston is very unique from all the places that I've traveled in this country on how the economics here, the communities here, the segregation to a certain extent that still exists here also needs to be a part of that conversation. So we have examples, and when Dr. Jemadari and I were putting this together, we were very careful to use it as an example, but to not use it as we are copying that, because we really feel that Boston needs to define it by itself from a Boston perspective, from the voices of Boston that can speak to it. And as Dr. Kamara shared at the beginning, we might come up with a model that it doesn't speak to any of the models that exist, but will become a model for other people to practice.
Thank you.
There is one, I want to just add to that one very briefly, because in looking at the uniqueness and specificity of other cases, in the case of Evanston, Illinois, one of the things that they did as they focused their study around the consequences of disparities in housing, was to use a cannabis tax as a tool to begin to apply the application of resources in order to repair that particular harm. I mean, this is just one specific small case in point about how innovative public policy can be used to begin to address the question. All too often, we are always, thinking about, well, it's the money. What about the money? Well, again, I want us to think about how are we expanding the pool. This is not a zero-sum question. And additionally, the question of repair is far more comprehensive than just money. We're talking about human experiences, the intergenerational consequences on health, and both mental and physical health, education, and the structure of policing. It's much more complex. Yes, money is involved. That's a creative way of solving a very small portion of the problem. And I think that we can come up with very other innovative ways ourselves.
Thank you, Dr. Kamara. Councilor Worrell, did you have any more questions, comments?
That is all. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Councilor Worrell. Next, Councilor Braden. Apologies for the switcheroo.
No trouble at all, Madam Chair. Thank you to the panelists. This has been a really incredible conversation this morning. I'm very focused on outcomes, like hurry up already, can we get there? I am coming to appreciate that there's a process that we need to go through, and the value of having a commission to really look at all the intersectionality of all the different issues that come to bear. Like the first one that comes to mind is the housing issue and the ongoing, the damage that has happened in the past, but the ongoing damage that's happening right now with institutional expansion into our neighborhoods and displacement of our immigrant and Black communities, because they just are being driven out of the city with rising housing costs. So it's a complex issue, and I really appreciate your thoughtfulness and your knowledge and your expertise and your commitment to doing this work. So I really don't have any other comments, Madam Chair, just to say, my focus has always been on housing and affordable housing for the working people in Boston. And I think that's where I come to this, is the housing piece and the damaging effects of redlining all across the city. The reality is that a huge amount of Boston was redlined, and we're seeing the contrails, the vapor trails of all of that still going forward into our future, and how land development is happening right now. So I appreciate the conversation, and I look forward to learning more and participating as best I can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilor Braden. Next, I don't see Councilor Bach, is that right? Councilor Murphy?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to the chair, Louis-Jean, and the sponsors for this. And as the vice chair of the Civil Rights and Immigrant Advancement Committee, I appreciate this hearing. I'm glad I stayed on, and I learned a lot from the panelists. Thank you. And I look forward to continue our work together and the commission when it's up and running, to be part of those conversations and learn more from all of you who are experts in this field. So thank you so much for this today.
Thank you, Councilor Murphy. Next we have Councilor Lara. Feel free to ask questions, comments, make any remarks. It's time.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of the panelists for coming and sharing with us what you're thinking and just giving us your wisdom as we kind of take on this path. I don't have any specific questions. I'm not sure if this will move to a working session and we can kind of have those conversations there in the future to have this. I think there are two things that are coming up for me. The conversation around philanthropy is something that's ever present for me. Before I came onto the city council, I was one of the directors of a national foundation. And this was a part of the work that I did with my colleagues in philanthropy, right? We had this conversation about what to do with these massive endowments and all of this wealth that could not be amassed without the exploitation of marginalized communities, right? And so having that conversation, teaching, teaching families, from family foundations, CEOs of big foundations, talking about this history, right? Looking at the impact that philanthropy has had. And so one of the things that's coming up for me as I'm seeing the list of people who should be here is that I'm thinking about how we widen this lens, right? It's not just the city of Boston, as people have kind of been repeating here. We need to think about philanthropic organizations who have made their wealth on the back of Black and brown people. And if I'm being honest, this hearing specifically is about reparations for African Americans. And when we think about this country, we also can't forget that the original sin, that our original sins are the genocide of Indigenous people, the stealing of Indigenous land, and the transatlantic slave trade. And thinking about how we expand this conversation around repair. Councilor Braden just talked about housing. We're talking a lot about land reclamation when it comes to housing, and we're talking about affordable housing and all of those things. And these are all conversations around repair. And in conversations around repair, all of the impacted communities should be involved. And so I would make a plug for widening our scope around reparations, particularly because we're in Boston, we're in Massachusetts, we're in Wampanoag land, and so many other Indigenous tribes that have suffered from what we've done here. And by expanding that lens, we can bring in philanthropy, We can bring in the universities, right? All of these people. I think one of the examples that we've heard of most recently when it comes to reparations has been Georgetown University, where the students took a vote to tax themselves. The students voted to tax themselves in order to provide reparations for descendants of enslaved people, African-American students there. To me, I'm like, thank you to the students. And Georgetown University has a $2.6 billion endowment. No student should be taxing themselves in order to give reparations to the descendants of enslaved Africans when a university has a $2.6 billion endowment that they only spend down 5% on every year, that has only gotten, this is from 2020, right? So it's only gotten bigger in the pandemic, as so many of them already have. And so there is some work that we need to do outside of the city of Boston. We can lead and we can set the example, but I think that we have an opportunity to bring in other people into this conversation who have more money, who have made more money, and who have this to offer. So I'm excited to be in conversation with all of you about what that looks like. And I would like to be in conversation with the makers around how do we expand kind of like this ordinance in the working session. How do we expand the language? How do we bring in people from foundations to kind of how do we bring them along to have this conversation? Because the resources are there. They're not only financial, but the resources are there. And there are creative ways that we can move to a repair harm and financially compensate, right? Like we're talking about a theft of labor, hundreds of years of theft of labor. And so I know that we want to zoom out beyond financial compensation, but ultimately money is owed. And so thinking about how we implement both of those. So thank you all.
Thank you. Yes.
Just something
go ahead,
very
Dr.
quick. Yeah, when you mentioned Georgetown, the students actually asked them to charge $27.20 onto their student fees, and that was in memoriam to the 272 enslaved Africans that were sold to keep Georgetown afloat. What you may or may not know is that 3 days ago, the administration said they were not going to pay reparations to individuals, but that they were going to set up a scholarship fund. And so they have resisted the students themselves, taxing themselves about, payment for the sins of Georgetown. And you're correct, we just did the study, and the endowment of Georgetown is one of the biggest of Catholic universities in the United States.
Yep. And so I think that that's one of the downfalls of this, that ultimately we can't have individual solutions to structural systemic issues, because even when individuals take it upon themselves to try to do it, the institution always has the power to resist. And so we really have to, this is why it's incredibly important that we have these conversations at the highest systemic level and at the structural level, and not just on a one-by-one individual basis. Because ultimately, white supremacy is the water, they are the waters that we're swimming in. And if students in good faith can try to make an effort and a university can say no still, then we know that we have to go further upstream to have some kind of impact.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilor Lara, for those comments, and Dr. Winbush for your additions. It looks like we're at 11:58, and I think Chief Solis Severa, you may have to leave, so just wanted to give you the opportunity to make any closing remarks at this time.
You're going to judge me, but I've just cleared off my calendar. I need to stay here.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So,
Thank you for making time. Thank you for making time and staying on. I guess I will go back to my colleagues to see if anyone has any additional comments or questions before we turn it over to more community voices, to public testimony, so that we can get a lot of folks in the room who've been working on reparations, who have comments. We've also received a number of written comments. Councilor Mejia, I've seen you've taken yourself off mute, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I just wanted to say, before we move on, I just in deep gratitude for just the wisdom and the thoughtfulness of my colleagues who have really helped us unpack this conversation. So I just really want to be just in deep gratitude. And Councilor Louis-Jean, for always, and whenever someone speaks, I have really appreciated your reflections on what you've heard and how you've brought your own self into the space. So I thank you for that. And I think that as we continue, just wanted to note that our hope is that once we go into these working sessions, it's where we're going to really unpack the language of this ordinance and get it to a place where we all feel that we're not going to make any compromises that waters things down in a way that devalues, and we don't want to replicate the white dominant culture. And this is our opportunity here in the city of Boston to put Boston on the map and to be a leader in this conversation, that we're going to have the political will and courage to be able to do just that, right? And so we don't want to do things the way they've been done before. It's obvious because of the city charter, there are some limitations that we have, but we have this moment and this time right now to really push and to lead unapologetic about the issues of the repairing the harm and holding ourselves accountable to ensuring that we're not replicating business as usual. And so really grateful to you, Chief, for understanding the importance of this conversation and staying here in community with us. And more importantly, in community with the folks who are gonna testify now, because I think that this is what it looks like when we're all leaning into the conversation. So I just want to just share my deep gratitude for you staying here with us. We did invite other chiefs, Chief Shagun Iruwu, but his schedule did not permit to be here with us today, but I know had it, he would have been here. And I know that during the working sessions, we'll have more opportunities to bring in other chiefs to the floor to discuss, including Chief Dillon in regards to housing. So this conversation is gonna get bigger, to Councilor Latter's point, and expanding the tent, if you will, to ensure that all voices are at the table and that we're all taking responsibility and that we're all gonna be held accountable to what this work looks like. I see that my colleague, Tanya Fernandez Anderson, has her hand up. So I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Julia. Thank you, Madam Chairman. Woman, I will be very brief. Really quick, I love the ideas that our sister Councilor Lara brought together. I think that those are conversations for the commission. I think that expansion on resources bigger and beyond are for the commission. But I think that our working sessions should lead us to logistics about what the commission will look like, as Councilor Mejia is pointing out. But I want to be very specific, and this is not judgment or, trying to, by any means, opposing anything or anyone's position. My position on this is that let's be very clear. Every single time we are addressing the African-American plight, somehow we commoditize it to benefit others or to dilute it or to be including other groups and eventually, as Councilor Mejia was saying, doing business as usual. Let's be very intentional that this is specific to a group. And yes, we need to address the Native American situation. We need to that's a whole nother project. That is probably, the genocide that we can't even begin to talk about right now, right? It's so, the atrocities that took place and the issues there is such a huge undertaking that I think it deserves its own platform. And I think that when we're talking about the African-American plight, when we're talking about Black people suffering in America, let's be sure and let's be critical, let's be intentional on just making this about Black people in America.
Thank you, Councilor Fernandez Anderson, for your comments. Really appreciate uplifting that. I don't see any other hands raised from my colleagues. I am going to, from the bottom of my heart, and with a feeling of immense gratitude, thank the panelists. I particularly, Dr. Winbush, when you started talking about, the royal family and about Belinda's plight, Harvard Law School recently, after student protests, after 2 years after I graduated, student protests really honed in on this issue, and the wealth that really undergirds Harvard Law School is from that royal family, is from those wheat chiefs that Belinda and her family had to endure, and that free and unpaid labor. So our institutions and our systems are all beneficiaries of this unpaid labor on the backs of our Black folks, on the backs of enslaved Africans brought to this country against their will, right here to Boston, not just South Carolina, not just the Carolinas and Louisiana, right here in Boston. And now the institutions that presume to be the epicenters of truth, whose endowments grew by $10 billion in the year of a pandemic, need to, yes, remove symbols, but also be involved in the repairing of the harm that has really stymied and damned our communities. Wealth is not the only metric of, monetary wealth is not the only metric for community success. That is especially true for Black and Brown people in this country who have persevered and who exist and continue to exist as works of wonder in systems and in a world not built for our survival, but it is an important metric to repair harm and to do the work of really closing those gaps. So I know that we have working sessions to come from this hearing, and I am grateful for all of your voices here, to the lead sponsor again, Councilor Mejia, and the co-sponsors, Councilor Morrell and Councilor Fernandez-Anderson. So thank you so much for your time. I know that this is just the beginning of a conversation with me and my colleagues, so thank you. We're gonna, at this time, we are now gonna move on to public testimony. We have a number of folks who are lined up here to offer their own thoughts to members of the public. I am going to ask that you, just because we have a number of people wanting to share their thoughts, their heart, their expertise on this issue, for everyone to limit your comments to 2 minutes so that we can get everyone's public testimony in. So the first on the list I see right now is, and I have a timer, sorry, just because I'm still new to this game, but we're limited in our time. So I'm gonna bring in, I see Tammy Ty is on the list for public testimony, but I don't see her. Oh, hey Tammy. Glad that you could be with us this morning, Tammy. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning, Chair Luigi, and thank you for your skillful facilitation of this hearing so far. Okay, I will work to stick to my timing, but greetings everyone. My name is Tammy Ty. I'm a resident of Dorchester. I'm a mother of 3 teenage children, voter, active community member, including in my role as Deputy Director of King Boston, one of the organizations that's named to sit on this commission. So I just really want to underscore this tremendous opportunity we have as a city to inscribe ourselves on the right side of history, right, in establishing this commission. And I'm imploring this body, who I know shares commitments to equity, inclusion, and economic opportunity, to move quickly to establish this commission, recognizing the need to repair from the past in order to fulfill on our commitments. And I also want to uplift that while we are focused on repair for Bostonians of African descent and need to keep that focus on, as counselors have been saying, all of our citizens stand to benefit from the new opportunities this repair will make possible. And actually, I want to cite a national study that Citibank conducted in 2020 entitled Closing the Racial Inequality Gaps. And it says in there that the racial gaps between Blacks and whites have really cost us all across a variety of areas such as education, housing, earnings. That loss stands at $16 trillion over the last 20 years. And if we start closing these gaps, a little bit of the theme of what Dr. Kumar was pulling up, the study also found that we can see $5 trillion of additional GDP over the next 5 years. And so establishing this commission brings Boston online to benefit tremendously from closing these gaps. And yes, it is not just about the economics of this, but those are real, right? We've lived with these gaps for such a long time that we think of them as quote unquote normal. And our collective vision about what is imaginable has been robbed by systemic racism. And this commission is our opportunity to breathe life into that vision and unleash infinite possibilities into our city. And now I also want to underscore that while the benefit will be for all, it's extremely important that the commission be trusted to do its work with autonomy and self-determination, which I think is underneath some of these questions around the payment, right? We've got to be trusted to do this work. And it has to be led by the descendants of those African slaves for whom we seek ultimate justice and repose. Just as you would in an interpersonal conflict, only those who have been harmed can determine what the appropriate repair should be. And thus reparations cannot be dictated by the offending system, right? So even this notion of the offending system holding this group accountable, the offending system cannot do that, even if the system is led by descendants of African slaves or other people of color. So the system must provide the resources, and as others have lifted up, there are other systems, private, philanthropy, that we're going to call into account through this process. Systems must provide the resources to support this work, but it's got to be led by individuals who are not beholden to the system. So I'll just close with, I implore you to put Boston on the right side of history. We're looking for this commission to be passed quickly and unanimously, right? So this work of repair and reimagining for our future can begin. So thank you, Chair Louis-Jean.
Thank you, Tammy. Good seeing you. Going to move on to Reverend Peterson. Thank you, Reverend. Nice to see you, Reverend Peterson. You now have the floor.
Okay, you can hear me, correct?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Reverend Kevin C. Peterson. I'm a seminary-trained ordained minister who possesses a honorary degree for the specific work I've done in Boston as it relates to redress, repair, and reconciliation. I live in Boston and I lead an organization named the New Democracy Coalition. In 2021, the NDC made the call for Boston reparations to Mayor Marty Walsh and to members of the Boston City Council. That call for reparation was heard across the globe as it was reported in the Associated Press. We made this call for reparations in context of changing the name of Faneuil Hall, a task that still needs attention, a task that is invariably connected to reparations. We started the Faneuil Hall name change movement in 2017. Needless to say, a commission that explores the issue of reparations in Boston is paramount. And in so many ways, Boston has a long way to traverse in order to substantively address the issue of racial antipathy towards Black Bostonians, who can trace and verify the harm inflicted on them through slavery and the extended Jim Crow practices. We must approximate justice and remuneration for an historically aggrieved class of Blacks who have suffered here in Boston in location. The suffering of enslaved Blacks in Boston was unique to its locality. The response to the issue of reparations must be specific to the nature and intensity of the injury imposed here in Boston. While the historical record has been suppressed, it must be known that Blacks in Boston suffered enormous theft, about which there should be restitution. To put it mildly, political agency was stolen. Personal identity was stolen. Epistemological systems were ruptured. Cultural paradigms were stolen. Wages were stolen. Familial and cosmological connections were stolen. All this deserves attention within the context of the commission we seek to create in this process with regard to the big crime that was made in the name of white supremacy. And we must find clear solutions and clear answers that constitute repair and reconciliation. Members of the council, you may well know that this matter of reparations does not generate ultimately from case law or from the context of state or city issued public policy, but from religious practice. Reparation has its root within the Western canon in the ethical practices grounded in texts as ancient as the book of Leviticus and the Gospel of Luke. Reparations are foregrounded even in the sacred societies of African spiritual engagement. For this, I urge you to think about the spiritual well-being of all Bostonians as you consider and vote to support the creation of this committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Reverend Peterson, for always offering us your very pointed insight. I'm going to go next to Reggie Stewart. Glad that we were able to have you here, Reggie. Let me make sure that you are able to speak. So Reggie Stewart, you now have the floor. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, and you have your 2 minutes starts now. So.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to be as brief as I can. Thank you for letting me speak. Yeah, a lot of interesting conversation. You know, commission versus office, the logistics of it. That's not really a big concern of mine. You know, I kind of leave that to the mind of the council of how they want to structure that. But what I am encouraged by is the need for including the community voices. This can't just be a bureaucratic process. The people have to be brought in. There's a lot of people, a lot of activists who have a lot of insight, who have studied and advocated on this issue. So I'm encouraged by that. I'm encouraged by what I'm hearing from the city council in terms of running to questions instead of running away from them. I've heard talk of running to speaking to a specific community of eligibility, to compensation, to dealing with the difficult question that the vestiges of slavery have driven Black Bostonians outside of Boston. So I would just encourage that if and when this commission moves forward, run to those difficult questions. The United States has been dodging the specific Negro question since the founding of this country. They've run away from slavery. They've run away from Reconstruction. They've run away from Jim Crow. They've run away from the stealing and hoarding of wealth. They've run away from the theft of land. So you have an opportunity to run to those questions, even if you find that those answers are beyond the capacity of the municipal government, because I guarantee you some of those questions you will. Like just a brief example before I close. If you were to close the wealth gap between the descendants of slaves and white Bostonians, I believe that would come around to $15 billion just to close the wealth gap. We're not even talking compensation for stolen labor, land, et cetera. And it's my understanding that that's almost 5 times the operating budget for the city of Boston. But just because that's the answer is hard, doesn't mean that you shouldn't run from the question. That you could say, hey, I can't pay this, I can't fix this, this requires a federal solution. So just because it's a hard process, don't run from it. Don't run from the specific question, even though it's a contentious one. Let's sit with the question, let's answer it honestly. And my hope is that if a commission is formed, that it will be empowered to do just that and include the voices in the community, specifically those descendants who are directly impacted by the institution of chattel slavery. But thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Reggie. Really appreciate. This is why we need to make sure that we always have community voices at the table, because your comments were just were really spot on, not to run away from the hard questions, but to drive towards them. The next person on our list is, I think Derek Smith is here. So Derek Smith, at least I saw, yeah, I see you here. Going to light, yep, unmute yourself, and your 2 minutes begins now.
Good afternoon, members of the Boston City Council. As you heard, the councilwoman said that my name is Derek Smith, and I'm here in support the New Democracy Coalition. And most recently, our friend Reggie Stewart, ADOS movement, Freeman's movement, FBA movement, and its efforts to change the racial climate, not just here in Boston, but throughout the country, and the creation of Boston Race Commission. As you guys know, here in Boston and the surrounding areas that Reverend King had called the beloved community, where truth and justice prevails. No task is more important at the time than building sound and functional racial relations between the city's Black community and the larger white political and economic structures. Since 2017, the New Democracy Coalition has been urging for reparations in Boston. In 2020, its call for reparations to Boston Mayor Walsh has made international news. This call has made more within the context of changing the name of Faneuil Hall as a reparative act. Our call sparked a movement in Boston. This call has been joined by other activists in the city of Boston and across the state. The New Democracy Coalition has engaged in strategic partners nationally on this issue. I stand with NDC and groups like Boston NAACP, the King Boston, Boston ADOS, who have joined this cause in great enthusiasm. Also, I would like to mention that the racial wealth gap in Boston had a report done by the Federal Reserve on the disparity of white, Black immigrants, Hispanic, and the few Asian groups. But Black Americans who ancestors told you for free are economically behind all those ethnic groups mentioned. We have to remember the early government sanctioned crimes done to the descendants of the former slave and those labeled 3/5 of a human being and freedmen. With this brief statement, I encourage members of the Boston City Council to create a commission on race in Boston to further explore reparations for Black Bostonians who have been the victims of slavery in the city. Thank you for the time. You guys have a good day.
Thank you, Derek. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for your comments and for joining us and for the work that you're already doing. Next on the list is Aziza Robinson. Good night. Hi, Aziza. Thanks for joining us. You now have the floor. You can unmute yourself and your 2 minutes begins now.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for having everybody here. I appreciate your work. My name is Aziza Robinson Goodnight. I have served as the project director for the Boston Reparations Campaign through the New Democracy Coalition for over a year now. And I'm a Bostonian whose family has been here for multiple generations and whose land has been taken by urban renewal. I'm a voter, mother, daughter, and an active member in the community at many levels. Please accept the statement for public record regarding docket number 0239. If Boston is to embody the phrase Boston strong, then the city government must be strong enough to deliver the sentiments and support to its most underserved citizens for its participation in one of the greatest injustices against humanity, the transatlantic slave trade. If Boston is to ever begin reckoning its century-old economic apartheid, it must acknowledge and rectify the places from where the hate stems from. This statement is an expression of my demand for a Reparations Commission in Boston. I'm aware and a survivor of the struggles within the Black community, especially as they pertain to social justice. Blacks have lived in Boston before its founding as a city, and thousands of others who built this country and arrived as enslaved people. Boston must apologize for a racist past and creating an image of Black existence as a danger for pushing the agenda of a racial bias in plain sight. Those who control the image control the mind. Along with many other Bostonians, I find myself grateful for this historic city council cohort, representing the most diversity the city has ever seen in its history. For this, I thank Representative Ayanna Pressley and Councilor Thomas Atkins for being the first Black woman and man to sit on the Boston City Council, trailblazing a path for Boston's historic cohort consisting of 7 Black men and brown leaders. As a Black Bostonian, I'm deeply grateful for what you all stand to represent on the City Council. But with this gratitude comes a great duty to ask you to remember where you came from in the city, to remember the plight of thousands of Black Bostonians and heard and underrepresented in Boston's success. Black citizens across Boston need your voice to help uplift an apology from the bowels of this city for its participation in the transatlantic slave trade and to support current reparative efforts for justice in form of commission. The most underserved communities have shown you up to get you in the positions representing their communities. Will you return the favor? Will you choose to stand by them? We will not be paying attention to the only words the city council has to offer us as lip service, but also the actions that you all choose to stand upon. We need Reparations Commission in Boston that includes art and culture and history as the heartbeat that drives Black people in order to create a safe space for Black existence. We must respect the work that has been done before us and continue to push for racial resolve for Black lives. And to your colleagues, that also work for us because there are Black people in every district of the city. I must remind you of this number: $3,343,772,866.38. The amount the 40 acres of land would be worth today that is owed and was promised to every African American when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This is your forefather, and it is now time to repay his debt. Any questions about how the commission members will be paid, with any mention of being less than any other member of any other commission, is irrelevant and disrespectful. Our contributions to America far outweigh most, and we deserve it all. I urge you and your colleagues to move quickly to establish a commission immediately in order to show the people of Boston that it truly cares about Black lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aziza, for your patience and for joining us and your work on reparations thus far in this city. Next on our list is Kaz Novak. Kaz, if you can come off mute. Your 2 minutes begins now.
Perfect. Good afternoon, everybody. I did also submit a written testimony because I was unsure if I was going to make it in time for this meeting. So I'll leave most of my statements for that. I'll just be quick.
Yes, and we have that. We have a record of your written testimony as well. So thank you. But we also are happy that you're able to join us here. So.
Cool. Thank you very much. I just want to say a few quick things based on what I've been hearing. It seems there has been considerable pushback to people talking about reparations in Boston, and I imagine that will continue to happen. I just want to ask, whose comfort are we prioritizing if we remain silent and if we choose to continue to not act? And just to say that, well, of course, the cost of reparations may be steep. I feel that there is money for things if we want to find it. Sometimes creative actions need to be taken, but reparations are absolutely critical, and I think a critical first step that needs to be taken to repair the deep harm done to Black and African American communities. So this happening is not an option. This must happen in our city, and I'm hopeful that the actions in Boston can lead to larger reparations payments throughout the country. But I think it can start in Boston, and we can do some considerable, important reparative justice beginning here. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaz. And we'll also be entering your written testimony as part of the record as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Next up is Jean-Luc. Jean-Luc, if you could come off mute and offer your testimony. Good to see you, Jean-Luc.
Good to hear my name always said the right way. Yes, my name is Jean-Luc Peritz. I'm originally from New Orleans. I'm a member of the Tunica-Biloxi tribe, guest here on Massachusetts territory, resident of Jamaica Plain, and president of the North American Indian Center of Boston. I serve on the executive committee of the Black Mass Coalition, and NACOP frequently partners with the New Democracy Coalition in King Boston. In solidarity, NACOP reiterates that this process towards a reparations agenda and action plan for the city of Boston must be led by those most impacted. In terms of how Boston and the Commonwealth has benefited from the oppression of Black and Indigenous peoples, of course, we can look to the 2005 repeal of the Boston Indian Imprisonment Act, which made it illegal for American Indians to walk the streets of Boston unescorted. We can look to the paper genocide through the mid-19th century race science on blood quantum, which impacts American Indian tribes across the United States today, which disappeared Indigenous peoples just for intermarriage with African peoples. An equitable, community-driven process for reparations would include ending racial profiling and discrimination in the provision of healthcare, providing scholarship and community development funds for those most impacted, and supporting processes of self-determinations for broader impacts of all towards all Black people of African descent in Boston. We look to the inclusion, especially of community members of NACOP who are Black and Indigenous, who can be restored in the wholeness of all of who our people are. And in closing, Madam Chair, I hope that my testimony is accepted in the spirit of liberté, égalité, fraternité. Tikach.
Merci beaucoup, Jean-Luc. We will very much receive it in that spirit of fraternité, brotherhood, liberté, liberty, and égalité, equality. I do not see anyone else from the public here to testify. I want to just give that like 15 seconds to make sure that I'm not missing anyone, because the community's voice needs to be front and center. Black and brown voices, especially in the city, need to be front and center in this conversation. So just checking quickly with my team to make sure that we've gotten everyone. There were some folks who were here probably because of the length of this important discussion are no longer here in public testimony, but I do thank everyone for coming. Encourage folks to send in written testimony if you would like. That email address for the Government Operations Committee is ccc.go@boston.gov. Again, that is ccc.go@boston.gov, and you can continue to send us your written testimony. We've also received written testimony, as I said, from Kaz Novak, but in addition, other members of the public, such as Chia Swan Chang, Rosemary Keene, Nancy Goldner, Julian Coleman, Lauren Cowing, Jessica Burke, Claire Gosselin, and Lynn Layton. We thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to write to our committee about your support or feelings or sentiments around this commission and around the work that we need to do here in the city of Boston to repair harm. And so that your testimony, written testimony, will be part of the record. I now want to turn it over to the sponsors and my colleagues to see if they have any closing remarks. So Councilor Mejia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairwoman Louis-Jeanne, for hosting a fabulous hearing. You know, you kept us on time, which is something that is usually very difficult to do. So we appreciate you. And now I just wanted to thank our public testimony folks who brought in additional things for us to think about. I really do appreciate the accountability piece. In this moment in time, it requires us to really lean in. So just thanking all of the members of the public that spoke and my colleagues who've participated in this conversation. And I really do look forward to the sense of urgency that this moment requires and moving this into a working session based on the things that we heard. And more importantly, working in deep community and creating as many opportunities for those who are living the realities and doing this work to continue to lead and guide the council in the direction that we need to move in. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. Next is Councilor Fernandez-Anderson.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I thank you for all the panelists and the public testimonies. I think that we're headed in the right direction. I look forward to the next step where we can actually talk about developing the commission. I think there were a lot of like wonderful feedback and research here today, and look forward to more. I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Fernandez-Anderson. Next up is Councilor Worrell.
Yeah, I just want to thank all the panelists and everyone who gave public testimony. Looking forward to having further conversation, and just happy that finally, you know, that we're talking about reparations here in the city of Boston, and it possibly being done.
Thank you, Councilor Worrell. Councilor Murphy.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, for a great hearing. And also thank you to all the panelists and also public testimony. I appreciate all. Thank you. I look forward to the work ahead.
Thank you, Councilor Murphy. Councilor Lara.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just grateful for all of the testimony in support of this ordinance. I look forward to working with the City Council and my colleagues to ensure that it's as impactful as it needs to be, and that the work that we're putting in is right-sized for what the people of the City of Boston deserve for this particular commission. I maintain a posture of being in solidarity with other oppressed people and thinking about how we ensure that with this commission and with other work that we move forward on the City Council. I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Councilor Lara. I don't see any of my other colleagues here, but I do want to thank them again for joining Council President Flynn, Councilor Liz Braden, Councilor Kenzie Bach, Councilor Lydia Edwards. I think those are all of the names of folks who joined but are not here at the moment. I want to extend tremendous gratitude to Chief Maria Angeli Solis Rivera for clearing that schedule and saying, no, I'm gonna be here till 12, and you're saying, no, I'm gonna be here till 12:33, because the work, this is big work. This is not something that we are going to have a solution to, tomorrow. It is work that folks, generations of Black folks have been working towards, and to have the administration here and present, to also be thinking alongside us how we get this done so that we can face the truth of our history, so that we can repair harm done and think about how we never again allow this to happen. And how we can make our people and our communities whole. So I appreciate you for being here. What a phenomenal panel. I also want to thank, of course, Chief Lori Nelson, Chief Resilience Officer, who is here. Hopefully next time we will be able to have her here for a longer period of time, along with other chiefs in the city of Boston, so that we can bring the weight of government to solving, to helping us address this issue of reparations. Fabulous panel of folks, Dr. Jamadari Kamara, Yvette Modestine, Dr. Raymond Winbush, thank you for your knowledge, your intellect, your wisdom, your heart, your expertise on this issue that you have brought to bear in this ordinance and in this hearing. This work really does start in the community and with the experts and with your expertise. And so we thank you for all that you bring and all that you have brought to this hearing. This is just the first step. Having this hearing on this ordinance, we obviously, given the range and breadth of this conversation, have a lot of work to do when we're thinking about imagining how do we have the most impact to address the question and study the question of reparations. We have great models with HR 40 on the federal level. We see what other cities have been doing, like Evanston, that we can learn from, but also lean into our own expertise here in the city of Boston in creating this commission. So I want to thank everyone for their time. We'll have working sessions on this for the future, and those dates will be shared with the public. So just want to thank everyone for coming, and to all the nonprofit organizations and activists who gave their time and public testimony. We thank you, because we lead by example, and you all are the example. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And also thank you to Central staff, City Council Central staff, without whom this hearing would not have been possible. I'm still learning how to run these hearings, and because of them, I want to just give Christine a shout out, Carrie, everyone on Central staff who has made sure that this hearing and for all virtual hearings and in-person hearings can run smoothly. So my deep gratitude to you as a new counselor, just still trying to figure out right from left. So thank you so much, and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening.